Hey guys, alright, today we're gonna be watching What If American Slavery Never Existed by Alternate History Hub. Ooh, this one should be interesting, especially, I think my prediction is going to be if there was not the slavery that we saw, and if we are saying American slavery, I don't know if this is just going to be solely about like the United States of America slavery, or if when we talk about American slavery, we also talk about the slavery that was common in the Caribbean as well, because it was not just, the plantations were not just in the south of the United States. There were plantations throughout the Caribbean. Those were the profitable, yeah, I pronounced that right, the profitable islands. So if we say American slavery never existed, I'm going to extend that to the Caribbean. And if so, then Caribbean probably would have been replaced by Native American slavery had they not died, and died from disease, etc. I'm also going to say the black population in America would not be anywhere close to what we see today. Like today, what? 13% of all Americans are black in America? I think that's the number. I can't remember. But say there's no American slavery, no Africans are being brought over. That number could be dropped down to like 5% or less. Who knows? Probably less institutionalized slavery, though. Maybe. A little less. Maybe it'd be less blatant. You know. Anyways, let's watch the video. Hi. Oh. Okay. Funny as how when I'm recording this, we are having a pretty big political movement going on. I think it should be obvious that, racism bad. That's all I'm saying. I just suck at timing.
Slavery has existed since the dawn of humanity.
Yep.
But when I mention the word slavery, I'm sure you don't think of the Spartans and their slaves. One specific era probably pops into your mind: American slavery.
And what's very interesting about this, though, is that I think this is a worldwide thing. It isn't, when you talk about slavery, especially I think in Europe, this can probably be the same. When you think of slavery and you're in Europe, you probably also imagine the slavery that was seen in the American continent area, in the Caribbean, and in the south of the United States. But we don't think of it as how the Greeks or Romans had it. Romans just enslaved anyone that they conquered. Greeks kind of did the same. And they bought their slaves. There's the Arabic slave trade during, I forget the time period, but at least when it was at its height. They had Africans, they had Europeans, they had everyone. That kind of slavery was never, in a sense it was. I think to say that it wasn't race motivated, or race didn't play a part into your slavery back then in those slave trades, yes and no. If you were a conquered people, you were still seen as a foreigner and of a lesser race in a sense. Like to the Romans, the Gauls were lesser peoples. It's kind of like how Hitler viewed the Slavs. Yeah, they were still white. But to Hitler, They were a different race. They were a different peoples. That's kind of the point I'm trying to make. In any sense, slavery bad. It's just that it's cheaper sometimes. You don't care about the you are a slave owner and you don't care about the health or well-being of your property. That's probably going to be cheaper for you, because then you can just, especially if you're conquering people. If you're conquering people like the Romans, it is cheaper to have slaves, because you conquer them. Now you don't have to worry about feeding these people or anything. You just take them to the mines to do work until they die. Yeah. But American slavery was a whole nother entity in which it was entirely Africans. The Africans that were brought over until a certain point in time. There did come a time when the African slave trade, the Atlantic trade, stopped. You can no longer bring in new Africans to become slaves. But it was still, probably explaining this pretty poorly, and I'm sorry. I'm trying to think of my words off the top of my head. But, yeah. It's interesting to see that how, even though this was very much an American kind of thing, this form of slavery, in which it was, mainly based upon the color of your skin, that view of that being slavery, what people primarily think of slavery, is a worldwide thing, even though it was primarily mainly seen in the United States, the Caribbean. To me, that's kind of interesting to think about, how like people in a different part of the world see this thing as slavery, even though, say in Europe, especially in Italy or in Greece, you have a history where your long time ago ancestors, saying you're a native Italian, native Greek, were a part of a nation that had slaves of not just African descent, but they would have slaves of, I guess, barbarian descent, Persian, etc. Various peoples made up slavery back then. But then, I don't know. I also don't know the entire history of slavery. I don't know what exactly happened to where Africans were chosen to be primary slaves. That's never really taught either, I feel like. I mean, you're just kind of like, yeah, Europeans just took away Africans from their homes and then brought them to Europe. And that's really all you're taught. You're not taught any further reasons as to why, and why they didn't just choose other peoples. Long rant / me trying to think things through. Over.
And even deeper, American Southern slavery. But American Southern slavery was just a tiny piece in a vast puzzle. Atlantic American
we are
slavery
talking about
was not something
as a
just
whole.
brought up in the 19th century. Slavery was the bedrock for major European empires for hundreds of years. It kick-started the economic ventures into a new world. Enslavement of Africans was for a specific reason, a financial reason. Millions of slaves provided the labor force to harvest the new gold of the world: cash crops, sugar, tobacco, cotton. These were goods the world.
But why were they specifically chosen? Because you could certainly take... Loud car just drove by. You could certainly take the poor and the homeless of Europe, and possibly that would be cheaper, because you don't have to make a trip down to Africa. You're already there in Europe. You just take them, bring them on over to America, and bam, force them to do the work.
craved, and centuries ago.
Remember, I am not. This is not my expertise area. This is I know some things about this time and about slavery, but it is not my field of study, so that's why I'm asking these kind of questions. I'm curious and I'm wondering.
Those
So I don't want anyone to feel like I don't feel like I have to prove, that I know my stuff. But this is not the stuff that I really know. Oh, this is such a bad video. I'm sorry.
Those that created plantations to harvest such crops latched onto the most lucrative business of its time. So, I had an idea that took me way too long to think about. What if that slave institution never existed?
I feel like to really answer that question, though, to really ponder a realistic outcome for that timeline where this form of slavery didn't exist, I think the realistic amount of time would actually be like years of study to like truly get an amazing understanding of it, to really predict it. But obviously, as a YouTuber, as Alternate History Hub is, he does not have that kind of time to do that. Give him a break for that.
The colonization of the Americas never involved bringing slaves to farm the land. No Atlantic slave trade. No African slavery. What would the past few centuries look like in a world where African slaves never came to American shores? I can just imagine the lovely, happy comments YouTube is known for. Whenever slavery is discussed, at least in America, it focuses on the human element. Cody, you say? How are you even going to tackle such a controversial and dark topic in world history? Well, Jimmy, I say, you take a month to think it through. The plight of the slave.
Yep, and here I am responding without that time to think it through.
The brutality of the journey, all are discussed in other sources that can teach the damage of slavery. For me, I don't want to focus on the brutality of the system. What I'm fascinated by is the effects those emotionless, bottom-line profits from slave-harvested sugar had on the world. Slave-based plantations dominated the economies of major empires that soon spanned the globe. The Confederates are pointed to as clinging onto slavery, but for far longer it was the Portuguese, Spanish, French, and English that built their wealth off of sugar colonies in the West Indies. It was how they could afford those fancy ships that blew each other up.
And the British kind of were more leaning towards the Confederate side because the Confederates provided certain goods that the British wanted. But the British did not want to honestly fight a war against the Americans because, British had other things to deal with. They had India now. They didn't. The idea of the 13 colonies was long gone. They didn't care anymore, really. But the cheap goods that the South provided is what they cared about. So, little addition.
I just find it fascinating such a controversial topic in history rarely has this aspect discussed. The financial, cold, calculating part that was the whole reason slavery was even a thing, and is never really talked about.
True. It's always talked about, like, obviously that human element should never be ignored. That should always be discussed. But I think it's very important to remember that it's typically money that influences these kinds of decisions. Because people are greedy. Humans are naturally greedy because humans naturally care about themselves and their family. And with money as the primary source of security, essentially, for your family and yourself, you're going to do things that will get you that most amount of money so that you can protect your family for generations to come, so to speak. So the idea of owning slaves, having that cheap labor where you don't have to pay them an income, looks fairly good. Same with then the idea of why, to put it into the modern perspective, why European and American businesses, typically the big corporations at the very least, because they have the money to then export their services, is that they then look to China, East Asia, Southeast Asia, etc., for their labor to make the products, because those people that live there in those developing nations of East Asia, China, etc., they can pay them cheaper than what it would proportionally cost in America. For instance, like what, 20, maybe they'll be lucky to make 25 cents a day or something in China. I don't know the actual, how much they actually get paid, but just as a showing the disproportionate, pay. But, if you, trying to explain this even better a little bit, trying to elaborate. It depends on the situation. For instance, slavery by late 1700s was kind of on the way out because it was becoming too expensive. Because you had to feed them and you had to house the slaves. That was expensive. And to pick cotton, for instance, that was too expensive. It was way too expensive. It was cheaper to just pay someone a super low wage where you then didn't have to worry about their food, their health, and their home life. You didn't have to worry about that at all because you just pay them like a penny an hour or something and then see them on their way at the end of the day. Slavery where you have to then pay for their housing and their food. But with the invention of the cotton gin, which I am certain he's probably going to touch on, that made the process of picking cotton so much faster that it made that the additional cost of housing and food pretty much negligible. Where it was probably still not cheaper than just paying someone a wage, but it was still extremely cheap. But that today, where it's like, certainly the additional cost of maybe paying a European or American to do the job, you can probably afford it, especially with these super major corporations. But it is still cheaper, therefore more profit to do it in Asia. I think I explained that well enough. I am not an economist. But yeah, businesses and people will be motivated by profit. I think as I've studied history, that's kind of one of the themes that you kind of see throughout history. Certain nation ambitions, kingdoms, kings, businesses, their motivation will be profit and security. So, and typically those kind of line up, profit and security, because money can buy you stuff to keep you secure. So, don't know how much I'm going to cut out or if I'll cut out any of that, but yes.
Sugar profits fueled the foreign policy of the 17th century world.
As I was saying, profit
economic ventures that
things.
led to countries we know today and events so important to our modern identities. So what if that was gone? Using my best historical knowledge, I've crafted a scenario detailing an alternate timeline. This is simply a brain exercise, a start to a conversation. I'm not acting like I'm some all-knowing person. This is simply one possible...
Yeah, remember, if you guys disagree with me, comment down below as to, your thoughts on... I guess the point I was trying to make earlier is how this kind of institution has adapted and evolved over time. It used to be, you'd bring slaves from a different country over to your country to do the work for you. Now what you do is you pay people in a different country to do the work for you because it's way cheaper over there.
Scenario out of the countless that could happen. So, before discussing the actual scenario, let's discuss some historical context.
Context
Just
is
for
everything
those
when
that
it comes to
don't
history.
know much, if anything, about this entire topic. Centuries ago, sugar was the oil of the 16th century. As any Walmart shopper can tell you, sugar is addictive. This too was the story hundreds of years ago.
Looks
The
more like
world
cocaine,
market craves
but sugar
sugar.
is kinda cocaine.
It's processed using a crop called sugarcane, a
Minecraft.
crop that can only be grown in tropical climates. Due to geography, sugar was rare in Europe.
Yeah.
By act of the perfect storm, subprime real estate showed up in the tropical region of the West Indies.
And the
thing
disappearing
about
of the
sugar
native
production,
peoples.
however, was that it was very labor intensive. That's an understatement. It was like a factory. The production of sugar was the equivalent of oil refining.
Yes.
It required a large workforce to do specific.
And it was extremely deadly to those working. Making sugarcane into sugar is extremely dangerous.
Production line tasks to get.
I remember, I can't remember it. I can't remember where I learned this, but like you can get burnt and your skin can like boil from the process so easily if just one mistake is done. It is the process of making sugarcane back then what is absolutely terrifying, scary.
An efficient product. The crystallized sugar. It was a hot and dangerous process. It started with the Portuguese in Brazil, who worked countless Africans to death in the mills like the secret little sociopath it was. The Portuguese had been building a coastal empire.
Yeah, I feel like because of just how huge Spain and Britain and France were, people kind of, leave out the Portuguese who kind of kicked all this off.
Along the African shores. They tapped into a rich trade network in Africa where gold, ivory, and most importantly, slaves were plenty. Europeans didn't go around kidnapping Africans. African kingdoms sold slaves to Europeans. West Africans had always practiced slavery in some form. Slaves were usually war prisoners from people more inland. Those slaves interested Europeans who needed.
Yes. Okay, so I think as I'm getting further context and / also kind of being reminded of how the African kingdoms acquired their slaves to sell to the Europeans. Very similar to European slavery before this time period, during Rome and Greece, etc. Slaves were war prisoners for much of history up until this time period. And then, so the Europeans come, and they need the slavery. They need the cheap, free labor, essentially. They go to someone who already has that labor, so that they don't have to, declare war on someone, conquer them, and then use those people as slaves, because that will cost more money than just going to someone that already has the slaves, buying the slaves from there, / trading for the slaves with guns, etc., and then taking the slaves to America. TLDR. That is the TLDR explanation, I guess, of slavery. Oh, slavery definitely should not be talked about that fast. It is something that needs to be discussed heavily.
A new labor force to cultivate their crops. Eventually, other Europeans like the English and French discovered Portugal's secret and began trading in Africa as well. A triangular trade system began to develop. While this is mentioned in history classes, it's very understated. Slaves worked the land to farm products, those products would then be sold to markets around the globe, and those profits buy more slaves from Africans, and the cycle continues. When imagining a different world in alternate history,
that's essentially
there's something that
trade.
always has to be worried about. The butterfly effect, where one event affects another, which affects another, like without World War I, World War II wouldn't have happened. When imagining a world...
Well, yeah, because then if World War I didn't happen, then World War II would have been named something else. That would have been named World War I. But the participants probably would have been different. I think I've just touched on this a little bit, before, and maybe the what if World War I or what if World War II scenarios.
World without African slavery. It's more like a house of cards.
Yeah.
The use of slave labor was the bottom set of cards. Remove that, and all the profits from that labor, which led to most historical events of the last few centuries, is entirely changed.
It's amazing how many events change. Like, you get rid of the American Civil War without, like, because the American Civil War was solely because of the South being scared that they would not be able to have slaves anymore. That's the secession of the southern states was solely because of the institution of slavery. It is stated in their secession documents. Without that Civil War, much of America is so changed. You don't have the Reconstruction period. There's so much that it's just, I don't know how he's going to cover this in the next 13
leading
minutes.
to a history pretty much alien to what we'd imagine. Events like the War of Austrian Succession, 7 Years' War, American Revolution, French Revolution, the centuries of complicated monarchies, which don't seem to matter at all changed by this one event never occurring. Now you know why this took so long. So let's begin to imagine this alternate scenario. There's only one thing changed. Europeans simply never consider Africa as a viable source of slave labor.
Yep.
There is no trade of blacks to colonies. We have to start off somewhere. So let's start off in an alternate 1640. By this point,
okay.
It's been more than 100 years since Columbus sailed to the New World. The Portuguese and Spanish have empires spanning across Latin America. The English and French have some too. The Spanish and Portuguese got a head start. The natural resources and people of the Caribbean was running dry, and so they began to grow crops like sugarcane and tobacco because you have to do something with the land. At first, these plantations used native labor,
okay,
but
as I
there
predicted.
wasn't enough natives on the island to be a reliable source of labor to build a vast colonial economy.
And because they were never exposed to certain animals that Europeans have, which then, because of the animals that the Europeans were exposed to, gave them certain immunities to certain diseases. When the Europeans discover the natives are not immune to the diseases that the Europeans are, because the Europeans, spent thousands of years with certain animals. So yeah, that's one of the reasons as to why the natives died off so quick, was because they didn't have that natural immunity after living with animals like the Europeans did.
Yeah. In our timeline, the empire solved this labor shortage by trading with Africans for Africans. Without any Africans, who will be the labor force? The only choice was between two groups, natives or colonial Europeans. Natives were dead, and going to foreign lands to farm wasn't the most attractive offer to Europeans. Even if it was, there wasn't enough Spanish, British, or Portuguese to make up the millions of African slaves that populated these lands in our timeline. Mostly Brazil. Oh, Portugal. In this alternate world, colonies have to deal...
Yeah, Portugal owned so much, but they were such a tiny nation. There is no way that they could have really fueled that economy with their white population that they had without... They needed to take the Africans and turn them into slave labor. Otherwise, they wouldn't have been able to really use the land that they had.
It was something we wouldn't have imagined. A labor shortage. See, when companies look to invest in new lands, they want to maintain a profit. Well, if there's a lack of people to work, the venture is riskier. Sugar mills are expensive and sugar prices are risky, but that risk is balanced out by free slave labor to cut costs. Colonies were an investment, and sugar production were payoffs. Cody, you say, why are you focusing so much on sugar? Well, Jimmy, or Billy, whatever, 75% of African slaves that went to the Caribbean went to sugar mills.
Yep.
So for centuries, it was the crucial profit maker for pretty much everybody. In this alternate timeline, without slaves, sugar production could not reach the heights of our own timeline. It is simply too labor intensive. It still exists, rest assured, but the cost of production means it certainly wouldn't dominate the market. This would bring the land value on these islands down, kind of like Kuwait, without oil. And if Kuwait didn't have oil, would Saddam have invaded it? Without all those slaves, the New World has a far smaller population. Islands like Jamaica, Hispaniola, and Cuba see their populations be made up of Spanish, British, and French colonists who willingly made the journey to these lands. They'd remain culturally connected to their home empires and even the states across the Narrow Sea. If we had to imagine them today, the Caribbean would be like a collection of European-like states. Slavery was a social force that reinforced ideals that whites were natural owners over blacks. This persisted for centuries.
Yeah.
So the conclusion is in this alternate
kind of that belief is still around in some people's stupid minds.
world, the social relations between blacks and whites would obviously be better. In this alternate world, while yes, there is no popular idea about how enslaving Africans was a natural good, this doesn't mean that there would be tolerance and sunshine.
Yeah.
Writing this part of the video was basically like going through a minefield. Even if I missed a mine, I'd still step on the ground and probably explode. After researching and theorizing, my conclusion is even if African slavery and other race policies never happened, human society is actually even more split by race. It's a trade. While in this alternate world...
because I guess then whites in America wouldn't be living alongside blacks. So I guess I can see that kind of argument. If you're not living alongside someone, it's going to be harder for you to then understand that person if you've never like lived alongside them.
Policy that Africans should be viewed as subservient, like in the pre-Civil War South. Instead, in this world, Africans are simply not thought about at all. Slavery introduced blacks into the social caste of European society. Without it, there is no region where both races interact daily, except maybe in Africa. Now, this needs to be explained. Slavery occurred because Africans were already viewed as lesser, as not fully human. In fact, in medieval times, Africans were one of those mysterious species who couldn't be Christian. Blacks were just as human and satanic as the mythical Cyclops men, or blue-skinned people of faraway lands. People wouldn't believe that Africans were a mythical species forever, but this shows that chattel slavery wasn't the genesis of racial tension.
Yes.
It was only a byproduct. This alternate timeline sees race relations simply go from one extreme to a bored exclusion. Now, why would this happen? Wouldn't Africans be eventually included into European society? Well, no. In the 19th century, even though blacks were in the United States, they were still considered foreigners of a kind. And even abolitionists, Abe Lincoln before the Civil War, believed after slavery ended, blacks would need to leave America for Africa, as they would always be foreigners. If even in our world, where blacks outpopulated whites in some areas and they were still viewed as foreigners, this would even be more prevalent when Africans don't even populate America. The only reason this inclusion occurred at all was because of the interaction between different races and the civil rights movement. It changed the way races were viewed across the West. The civil rights movement used this connection to the land to show that blacks had been in America for centuries and were just as American as whites. Now, this didn't end racism or anything, but it represented a precedent that blacks had connection to the land. Why is this important? In this alternate world, the only people settling North America, maybe even an independent United States, is Europeans in some form. British, Irish, Germans, Poles, Russians, you get the point. Even with all these new immigrants, the one immigrant Americans would never see is an actual African. What this creates isn't a culture of institutional racial hierarchy. It just creates a nation which really never thinks about minorities at all because there isn't any. If anything, the only thing that would continue is the tension between Catholics and
Californians are their own people,
Protestants,
is what I'm getting
Germans,
from this.
Irish, or Anglos. That'd be the ethnic tension in the US. The African, who never had a sizable minority in any European nation, is just never considered a citizen, like the Chinese in California, a perpetual foreigner. a tribalistic view of the world involving the European realms of North America, the coast of Brazil, Australia, the Caribbean, and Europe. With no civil rights movement of the 1960s, this idea never goes away. If we were to look at an alternate 2017, the US is pretty much entirely European descendants. This lack of Africans means the concept of the 18th and 19th century of race and country doesn't leave. White man's burden still exists in some form as colonization occurs throughout the world for resources, and that really just stays the same. So it's a weird limbo where downright institutional racism doesn't exist, but instead it's just apathy, and maybe scientific racism and eugenics too. God, this.
Hey, I don't know about you, but when I heard that America was planning on buying Greenland, I was just like everybody else. I was like, what the heck?
Video is not going to be popular. Now, while the Caribbean doesn't grow much without slavery, the American South doesn't have this issue. The 13 colonies were a much more appealing destination to colonists than a random island. So while there is never these sprawling plantations, the South is populated by smaller tobacco and cotton farms worked by indentured servants or paid white laborers. In this alternate world without much going for it other than agriculture, the power dynamic between North and South is entirely imbalanced. Before the railroad, the North frankly got the better real estate, the Great Lakes, and so they were able to industrialize faster. Without the finances from cotton, the South is left in the dust as the North outcompetes in finances, population, and technology. Europe. Cody, why are you sighing? Well, Jimmy, the issue when talking about slavery is those profits, and what those profits helped to build was European empires. Those empires weren't simply across the world, but wars against one another, including the 7 Years' War, War of Austrian Succession, Napoleonic Wars. You get the point. Going back to my House of Cards statement, it really is like pulling the rug from all of these events. Because so much changes, I can only theorize in very broad terms. Since European attention shifts from the Caribbean to the continent, it also shifts from North America to the rest of the world. Sugar forced Europe to focus on a very small section, the West Indies, instead of simply spreading out to other richer areas like India. For the next few centuries, European empires are focused on the much more profitable Asian trade than American colonies. This is reflective in their foreign policy. The Dutch would have to compete for the East Indies since France and Britain aren't fighting each other over the West Indies. Yet, since we're talking about African slavery, well, what happens to Africa? The slave trade was a double-edged sword. It made coastal kingdoms who captured slaves extremely wealthy, but it also depleted the continent of 10 million people.
Jeez.
Short term, slavery was fine for Africa, but long term, it brought on an apocalypse. In this alternate timeline, without slavery, Europeans trade with Africans, but just not as much, as there is no slaves. This doesn't mean that these African kingdoms would still survive though. Frankly, even without slavery, the Industrial Revolution still would have occurred, even if it was just centuries later than in our timeline. Africa would then be colonized just like in our own. West Coast African kingdoms would then become client states to industrial era Europeans. In a world without the African slave trade, that centuries of forced human migration and trade wouldn't have happened. The European empires never would have made immense profits from their sugar colonies and instead would have focused on old world lands for investment. The issue of race is never really brought up because there was never a sizable minority of any race to bring that to attention. Instead, the world is divided among nationalistic and racial bubbles. The reason why this video took so long to make was because of one thing. How do I even tackle a topic like this?
Yeah.
When you talk about slavery or any race-based content, it's a firestorm. What do you think would happen in a world where the Atlantic slave trade never happened?
I'm gonna give my own hypothesis. I'm gonna actually differ on his idea of the Industrial Revolution not happening for... It would take longer for the Industrial Revolution to occur. I think it would have happened sooner, because I think that when a labor shortage happens, I feel that the that there is then more innovation because you want to then make up for that lack of labor. You want to make up for what you are missing. That is kind of what the advancement of technology is the pushing to change things, to make things cheaper, make things more profitable. If you have a labor shortage, but you still want to get into that sugar, someone somewhere is going to figure out a way to make up for that labor shortage so that you can then make getting sugar cheaper. Or you find a way to dig up sugar cheaper, and then you just hoard it and sell it for a very high value, essentially what they do to diamonds. Diamonds are cheap. There's a bunch of them. They aren't expensive. It's a fake price. They just hoard all the diamonds and gold and then slowly trickle it out into the world to keep the value high. An artificial value, so to speak. But yes, that is my thoughts on it anyways. I think Industrial Revolution possibly could have happened sooner because Britain still had the resources to fuel the start of the Industrial Revolution, coal, the kind of land. And even though they are colonizing and they may not have as much money, they still have the kind of territory and kind of people / kind of public education, not really, to really kind of fuel the Industrial Revolution. But who knows, because of how much of a domino effect the American slavery was. It's really hard to tell. Let me know what you guys think down in the comments below. Let me hear your hypotheses down there. Explain them in depth if you want. I will read them. Actually, probably the more in depth you go, the more likely I will be to read them. But yeah, thank you guys for watching. If you enjoyed, remember to hit that like button and subscribe for more. Thank you.